How would you mind map YouTube? Would you create fun graphics? Would you break down its history and data? Or maybe, would you brainstorm its importance in modern culture? In 2010, Steve Jobs introduced the iPad. Almost 40 years before, Alan Kay designed the Dynabook, the iPad's predecessor. Alan Kay went on to invent the modern windowed interface, the object-oriented language Smalltalk, and to win the Turing Award. All these developments required breakthrough thinking. In a lecture, Alan Kay famously said, "Perspective is worth 80 IQ. To take our mind maps and learning to an advanced level, we need perspective." Here we have one perspective, and here another. Only when we look from multiple perspectives do we see the true object, and all of the hidden detail. If you've watched one of the many mind map tutorials out there, they end up creating a mind map like this one, or that one, or that one. Each is a one perspective mind map. To research the effects of one perspective, we can track a student's eyes while they study. Eye trackers illuminate the eyes with infrared light and track their orientation with cameras. From that orientation, researchers can visually follow attention and focus during reading. Watch how this child reads the text. We can tell how long they focus on words or go back to read again. In 2005, researchers applied this technique to study perspective effects. For the experiment, 36 undergrads studied a medical document covering 4 diseases. The document was broken into 5 sections, like prevention and support groups. Every section covered all 4 diseases. However, before the students read the text, they were split into groups. Each group was told to take one perspective. While reading, they'd pretend that their friend had contracted one of the diseases, and they were performing research to help them. For the results, attention was measured with eye tracking, memory was measured with a delayed recall test, and processing was measured with a think aloud protocol. Try to put yourself in the context. You're reading this document with lots of medical information. The information in orange is relevant to helping your friend. What would you do? And where do you think your eyeballs would spend the most time? Based on the results, the researchers concluded that you'd spend more time focused on the orange parts, and your recall would be better on the orange parts. That's probably not surprising, unless you don't like your friend. However, if our goal were to cover all the material, we have to consider how we should focus on and recall the other diseases. That one perspective only motivated partial coverage. With more than one perspective, we might be able to get full coverage. In 1967, James Pickard and Richard Anderson had finally completed their pioneering experiment on perspective. After seeing the results, they wrote, "It is inappropriate to speak as though the importance of an idea unit were an invariant structural property of text." They were referring to the fact that the subjects in their experiment had all disagreed. While reading a story about 2 boys walking through a house, the subjects who had taken the perspective of a potential burglar argued the importance of details about expensive items and ways to break in. On the other hand, subjects who had taken the perspective of a home buyer noticed the leaky ceiling. In other words, we can't just ask if something is important or why something is important. We have to ask that given a particular perspective. That massively changes the mind map we create. That might explain why people have trouble trying to create the perfect mind map. One topic has many valid perspectives. Without purposefully taking a perspective, we get stuck with analysis paralysis, tripped up by an infinite number of connections and layouts. Going back to the first example, how would we mind map YouTube? First, we need a few good perspectives. Generic perspectives are dependable and reliable. You can't go wrong with perspectives like historical, political, cultural, economic, taxonomical, procedural skills, and tools. With relevant personas, you can get more specific. Relevant personas for YouTube might include creator, online educator, venture capitalist, corporate marketer, virality researcher, software engineer, or regulator. Alternatively, we might find perspective from a focus question, which comes from Novak's concept mapping. For YouTube, these could be, how does YouTube compete with TikTok? Or, has change in YouTube content reflected international cultural shifts? If I were studying YouTube as an advocate of child safety, I'd probably pick the regulator persona as my main perspective. But I'd also want to look at historical developments inside YouTube, how creators are treated, and how corporate marketers targeting children use the platform. Notice I ended up with one primary perspective based on my goals. However, I will use other perspectives to get better coverage and avoid analysis paralysis. When I encounter keywords and material that don't quite fit my current perspective, I can offload and save them under different perspectives. And for advanced retrieval, I can mind map from memory using a different perspective. When learning, the schema needs to fit the perspective. We know perspectives could be historical, economic, and more. And we know schemas could be different mind maps, flowcharts, timelines, and other things. And these could be populated by prior knowledge. Piquet and Anderson came up with a second theory for why perspective could improve recall. They wrote, whether or not a detail will be learned depends upon whether there is a niche for it in the structure. They were hypothesizing that activating a schema prior to reading creates natural places for new information to fit in. I'd argue we could make this more obvious. Pretend we're studying YouTube using inquiry-based learning. We're coming up with questions we want to learn and asking ChatGPT or Google. And pretend we've activated a timeline schema for YouTube and filled in the CEOs at these two time periods. What should we ask next? If we're even mildly engaged, we should see a glaring empty area on the timeline. We'll probably ask, who ran the company between 2010 and 2023? In other words, a perspective activates one or more schemas, and a schema activates questions. So, does mind mapping work for math? It's really not the right thing to ask. Math isn't a particular perspective, so we can't talk about which schema is appropriate. If I took the perspective of a machine learning engineer overviewing linear algebra for a project, then yeah, mind maps work for math. If you want to support the channel, check out Omni on the iPad App Store.